Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 7th Sci Paul for Sci lecture. We are thrilled to welcome Charlotte Selton. Charlotte earned her bachelor's degree from Emory University in both physics and political science. She now works at the American Physical Society, or APS, which we'll hear about today, as a member Advocacy Senior Associate, where she manages APS's grassroots and grasstops advocacy programs. She also works on a range of science policy topics and is especially passionate about making physics a more diverse and inclusive field. So let's welcome Charlotte.
Thank you for the introduction, Jen. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming today. So as Jen said, I'm a member of the American Physical Society's Government Affairs team. I understand that we might have folks in the room from a wide range of science, STEM departments. So for those who don't know, the American Physical Society is the largest physics member organization in the US. It represents about 50,000 physicists across the US, some working in universities, but also some in industry. So I am a registered lobbyist in my role with the American Physical Society. But my job probably doesn't look like the Hollywood version of a lobbyist. I don't meet with politicians or policymakers. I don't have really exciting lunches where I'm just expensing it all. Instead, I work on the grassroots, grasstop side of advocacy. So that means that my job is to give everyday APS members, so grad students, postdocs, faculty, researchers, the tools and training that they need to be effective advocates. Although I'm going to talk about immigration policy today, I want to be clear that I am not an immigration lawyer, and I don't have expertise on every facet of immigration law. I especially don't have the expertise to advise on individual visa cases. Instead, this will be an overview of the biggest areas of overlap between immigration policy and science policy, with some examples of advocacy that APS has done in this realm, and types of advocacy that you could do. My goals for this afternoon is that everyone leaves with a fundamental understanding of how immigration policy impacts science, an understanding of a variety of methods and targets for advocacy, and some ideas on how you could get started in both volunteer and professional advocacy. So just so that I kind of know who's in the room, I'm going to ask folks to do a quick raise of hands if you have a hand free from meeting. So who here considers immigration policy one of the issues that's really close to your heart? So something you care a lot about. Okay, great. All right, so then who here feels like they have a solid understanding of immigration policy? Like you're confident that you could explain at least the basics of it? Okay, totally fair. Hopefully some people will be feeling more confident at the end of this talk. Then on the other side of things, who here has advocacy experience at any level? Like you sent a letter to Congress or you met with the president, anything in that range? Okay, a couple. I love to see that. Wonderful. And then is there anyone here considering a career in policy or advocacy or government relations? Okay, couple folks. All right, well, thank you. And dive in to the next. So to give you a brief overview of what APS's government affairs team works on, we do a wide range of science policy topics, not just immigration policy. Every year, one of our major events is Congressional Visits Day in January, when we have about 100 physicists, ranging from graduate students through folks who are nearing the end of their academic careers, all join us in DC for a fly-in advocacy event where they meet with generally upwards of 100 different congressional offices to talk about key science policy issues that are impacting our community that year. So this past January, the members that were meeting with these offices talked about 5 different science policy topics: federal research and development funding, visa reform for international students, K through 12 STEM teacher preparation, methane emissions mitigation and reduction, and improved data collection policies for LGBTQ+ scientists. So there are a number of factors that go into deciding what policies we prioritize and what policies our members end up advocating each year, including what the physics community cares most about. So at APS conferences, we always poll our members on what topics they care the most about in this extremely rigorous sticker-based polling method. You can see it's color-coded by career stage. So the yellow is students. And what we see folks care the most about year to year and how it changes helps shape what we decide to advocate on. So this is from 2 weeks ago at APS's March meeting, which was in Las Vegas this year. And you can see that we basically had a four-way tie between federal research funding, visas and immigration, climate change, and diversity and inclusion in STEM. So although today we're just going to be talking about one piece of the science policy pie, immigration policy, the key takeaway I want from this is that immigration policy is one of the top concerns, at least for physics. I expect that it's similar in other science fields. So let's get into that. So immigration policy is a huge policy area, and we don't have enough time today to talk about every single facet of it. So instead, I'm going to focus on two parts of immigration policy that have some of the biggest impacts on the science community, but also where scientific voices carry particular weight and advocacy. So the first one of these is research security policy. So when I say research security, what I mean is policy that is meant to prevent espionage or international intellectual property theft. But often we see these policies inadvertently restrict or discourage international collaboration. So they catch scientists who are not spies and are not attempting to steal research and give it to another country. But because of the scrutiny or being put on trial, it ruins careers and causes folks to withdraw from international collaboration. Then the second topic I'll be discussing, high skill visas. I think you're probably a little bit more familiar with what that area is. Of course, there are other aspects of immigration policy that impact scientists and that I'm sure some of you care really deeply about. The DREAM Act, dreamers, clearly there are dreamers in science. Family-based immigration definitely matters to scientists whose families might still be abroad. And the broad advocacy approaches that we're going to talk about today could apply to any of those topics. I apologize for how grainy this image is. Fortunately, I don't have a better resolution because it was made for 1.5-inch buttons, but I did bring some of those buttons with me today. So if you would like one, I can pass them around during the Q&A. Now, although I imagine we're probably in agreement with this, based on the fact that you decided to come to this talk, we've previously discussed why immigration is so important to the US scientific community. So immigration has a huge positive impact on science across multiple dimensions in the US. Economically, in the 2021-2022 academic year, international students contributed about $28.4 billion to the US economy. They also supported over 300,000 jobs in the United States. When it comes to the science and technology workforce, it's hugely made up of international scientists or immigrants. In fact, in 2018, more than half of all advanced, so graduate STEM degrees were awarded to international graduates in the United States. Also, 36% of US physics Nobel Prize winners from 1901 through last year, 2022, are immigrants. APS regularly surveys its members on a variety of topics, but one of our recent surveys was of 300 domestic students and early career APS members who regularly interact with international colleagues. That survey found that over 90% strongly agreed that international students and scholars make important contributions to research conducted in their laboratory. And a similar number of them strongly agreed that international students and scholars are important to their personal experience as scientists, students, or researchers. Key benefits that we saw come up again and again in those surveys that international students bring to the lab include strong scientific knowledge, new ideas, diverse points of view, and opportunities for cultural exchange. We're also living in an increasingly global world, and science definitely reflects that. In fall 2021, nearly 80% of US physics professionals reported active collaborations with colleagues in other countries. And I imagine that probably some of you have similar experiences. So overall, this is great news. Science is doing well, and we're benefiting hugely from immigration. So what is the problem? Why do we still work on immigration policy? So unfortunately, the US has become less attractive in recent years as a global destination for scientific talent. Data from an APS survey showed that current graduate students and early career scientists are more likely to have considered pursuing their career outside the US when you compare it to those who are in their degrees even just a few years earlier. Maybe you've experienced this yourself. Maybe you've talked to some classmates or colleagues who are considering moving abroad. So I'm curious what you think might be some reasons that we're seeing this trend. Any ideas?
I mean, the election of Trump really changed a lot of perception.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just to ask, I'm assuming this is at the same point in their careers, right? Because like if it's
So it's at different points, but it asks if they ever in their career ever
I see.
considered it.
These ones who got their masters alone in US, Europe, but in India, the waiting time, the waiting time is like 120 years.
Yeah.
So there's no point being consistent.
Yeah.
Yes, catching up, United States where it is technologically and the science is a lot more federal alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have all hit the nail on the head. So we wanted to figure out quantitatively why this is happening. So we had another survey asking these same graduate students and early career physicists who indicated they were considering leaving the US after graduating to pursue their career elsewhere, and asked what the top factors influencing that decision are. So the number one factor is a pathway to permanent residency or citizenship. So that's like what you said, just such a long waiting period in the US. Some people have to cycle between different temporary visas for years and years before they have any permanent residency. And then the second biggest factor was the perception that the US is becoming unwelcoming to foreigners. So I think that really goes to what you were saying about the election of Trump. I think that did change how people see this country. And then better employment opportunities, family, finances, all also have a significant impact. So to advocate effectively on immigration policy, you need to understand how and where immigration policy is made. So this is federal level policy. It happens in Washington, D.C. State and city governments could pass resolutions so they could express support or dissent for certain immigration policies, and they can inhibit enforcement. So that's like sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. But the policy that most impacts the scientific community in the US is all federal level. So like visas entirely decided at the federal level. Recent immigration policy shifts have almost entirely come from the White House and executive orders. So DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that was an executive order. Trump's travel ban, executive order. The last major immigration policy that we actually saw passed by Congress was back in 1986 in the Reagan administration. And that was the Legal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. In the past 30+ years, we've seen a lot of false starts, a lot of hopes of putting together a big bipartisan immigration reform package, and all of them have fallen flat at the end and not managed to actually make it into law. However, that doesn't mean that we are never going to see immigration legislation pass Congress again. In fact, to see some of the changes the scientific community needs, it'll have to pass Congress. Visa reform is not something that executive orders alone could solve. But let's start by talking about a research security case study. So who here remembers hearing about the China Initiative? Can you just raise your hand if you've heard of this? Okay, so not many of us. So the China Initiative launched back in November 2018 under the Trump administration, and it was a Department of Justice effort to prevent industrial espionage from China. So the underlying idea behind it was that researchers and students are stealing intellectual property from Americans as part of this state-sponsored Chinese conspiracy. There are some research areas that are sensitive to national security, and there are some countries that we know have attempted espionage. Not only China, there's a number of countries that we have found examples of in the past. However, not every area of science is sensitive to national security. At least in physics, some of the areas that are sensitive would be quantum, AI, machine learning, biotech, advanced materials. In astro detectors research and work, that is sensitive to national security. But the vast majority of fundamental research does not impact national security and really should be open to the maximum extent possible. It doesn't make sense to close that off to international collaboration. We're just going to work slower and learn less. Most cases prosecuted under the China Initiative were professors who had undisclosed funding or relationship to China. Most of these professors were not like Chinese immigrants. A lot of them were Americans who just happened to have some funding from China. Although there were some cases that people were found guilty in, they were fraud cases, there were no spying charges that resulted in convictions. However, the ambiguity of this policy had a chilling effect overall on science. Some universities handed down recommendations to all researchers to suspend collaborations with scientists in China because they just didn't want to risk a false accusation or becoming embroiled in the Department of Justice investigation. There were also individual researchers who decided to change their entire research area from something sensitive to national security to something that is not relevant to national security, just because they were worried about unfair scrutiny and discrimination. APS collected data during this period to find out how this policy was impacting the physics community. And you can see some of that on the screen right now. Nearly 1 in 5 physicists decided to withdraw from an opportunity because of this policy. This also resulted in disproportionate and unfair scrutiny on scientists of Asian descent. Remember how I said that the second biggest factor motivating scientists to pursue careers outside the US is hostility to foreigners? Policies like this are causing that.
Did immigration from China change because of this? Did Chinese scientists stop or even doing this? Are there any studies on it?
I don't think it's soon enough. I don't think that we've had enough time to get that data because this policy just ended in 2022, and normally data lags. But I would be surprised if it didn't. There was also the COVID pandemic smack dab in the middle, which overall caused fewer international students from all countries to come to the US. So that'll also need to be cleaned up. But great question. So APS ran a variety of advocacy campaigns targeted at either a repeal or a revision of this policy. So focused on the executive branch, we had a letter from the then APS president recommending reforms that would more narrowly focus the China initiative on just research areas that are sensitive to national security, change the name and clarify the intent so that it didn't result in such disproportionate scrutiny and discrimination against Asian scientists and scientists of Asian descent. We also had meetings with the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, talking about how it was impacting our community. We had a grassroots campaign. So we had APS members from across the country who sent letters to their members of Congress and their senators sharing how this was impacting them, their labs, their students. And then we also, as I said, conducted surveys to get concrete data that we could give to the administration about how this was harming scientists rather than helping protect science. In the end, the China initiative did end, as I said, in February 2022, and that was a huge win for our community. APS was the leading voice from the scientific community on this issue. Most policy issues we work on, we're working in collaboration and lockstep with other science organizations. This was one where most other science associations weren't really weighing in. It was a sensitive topic and a hard one to talk about. But we decided that it was just too important to physicists to not take action on. Undoubtedly, the China initiative is not going to be the end of research security challenges for the US scientific community. So we are staying activated on this policy area. Now let's talk about high-skill visas. So some of you might hold one of these visas. If you don't, you almost certainly know someone who does. But just to make sure that we all have an equal understanding of the jargon, let's run through what stage of career each of these visa types applies to. So who might get an F1 visa or qualify for F1 OPT? Anyone know?
Students.
Exactly, yes. So that's students. And then optional practical training for right after you graduate. How about J1 visas?
Postdocs.
Yeah, visiting scholars, postdocs, exchange students, all of those would have J1 visas. And how about H1B? Yeah, so workforce, faculty, scientists and industry, those all need H1B visas. APS doesn't actually work on H1B policy because there's not consensus within the US physics community on what policy changes we need to fix H1Bs, but we do work on the other two. So now that we all know the jargon, let's discuss some real life examples of visa policy. So the Keep STEM Talent Act is a bill that APS has been working on for years now. So this is a bill that would go right at that first #1 factor that is motivating scientists to move abroad for their careers. This would give a clear path to permanent residency and citizenship. So the first change that the Keep STEM Talent Act would make is it would allow F1 visa seekers to express dual intent. So that means that when you apply for your student visa, you could say, not only do I want to study in the US, I also want to pursue a career after I graduate. Right now, F1 visas are not considered permanent visas. So if you say that you plan to stay after that visa term is up, that could actually be grounds for your visa being denied. Then it also exempts international students who earn graduate STEM degrees and then get a job offer from a US company from the green card. That would reduce waiting times, much clearer pathway to permanent residency. This is bipartisan legislation. We have seen Republican co-sponsors on this bill in the past, which might be surprising. We've also deployed a variety of advocacy approaches aimed at the legislative branch since this was first introduced in 2019. We have had letters from APS leadership letting Senator Durbin know that we appreciate and support his advocacy on this issue, as the sponsor of this bill. Realistically, he already knows that because we worked with him on the initial introduction of the bill, but having that letter in hand publicly helps him advance it to his colleagues. We've also had grassroots email campaigns where hundreds of APS members have written to their elected officials about how this bill would improve science. We've had students and faculty meet with congressional offices and elected officials to talk about why we need this bill. And we've also had op-eds in major papers targeted at key politicians. One recent example is last year we had an op-ed placed in the Houston Chronicle directed at Senator Cornyn of Texas, asking him to support this bill. He's the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Border Security and Immigration, and this bill gets referred to the Judiciary Committee. I don't know how much you know about how bills progress through Congress, but that means that he has control over whether or not this actually gets discussed or whether or not it just dies in committee. So far, it's died in the Senate committee. So we have seen some partial progress on this, although it has not passed into law yet. We have seen it pass the House before. That was before the House flipped parties. We also saw last year it was introduced as an amendment to the NDAA. So that's the National Defense Authorization Act, a bill that passes every year. It didn't pass as an amendment, but that is an example of a possible pathway this would happen into law. Realistically, the odds of this being passed through the House, the Senate, and signed by the president as a standalone bill are very, very low. Remember that I said that immigration policy hasn't passed Congress since the 80s. However, it's possible that it could pass added on, tacked on to another bill. That's a very common way for policy to make its way into legislation. For example, a similar bill that we had advocated on for years was the Combating Sexual Harassment in STEM Act. It didn't pass as a standalone bill, but it was folded into the Chips and Science bill last year. That passed, and so it's now law. All right.
It's hard to pass these as standalone.
So immigration policy is fairly polarized, and because this isn't a budget bill in the Senate, you need you can't just do it with a 50 vote margin. You need to get the majority, which is a big challenge because the Senate is so close, and we would need a number of Republican co-sponsors to vote for it. And normally bills, when they pass, get things added on to it. So even though, as I'll talk about in the next slide, most Republicans do support this bill and policy like it, because both parties will try to tack other things onto this bill, it ends up as a poison pill and it won't pass. Yeah.
So you talked about the new ones that for F1 seekers. So how does it work today in terms of like if you want to call an F1 visa and then you want to stay after, what do you have to do? Yeah, it's once.
Well, you have to get a different visa. F1 OPT can make that a little bit easier because F1 OPT optional practical training allows you to work for a couple years if you got a STEM degree in like the industry in your field. It's considered training, but then you'll have to apply for another visa. And sometimes we see folks that have to go through 4 or 5 different visas before getting permanent residency. And when you don't have permanent residency, there's always the risk and concern that you'll get denied the visa and you'll have to leave the country. It's really hard to like build a career, build a life, settle down.
Yeah, okay.
Great question. So we talked about this bill at our congressional visits day this January. And after that wrapped up, we asked 100 or so APS members who met with offices and talked about this, how the office received that. So overall, you can see that on the 1 to 5 scale, it was very good, 4.2. So most people were rating it positive or very positive. But you can also see here the breakdown between Democratic and Republican offices. So you have an idea on the sample size, this was about 100 congressional offices that went into these numbers. So Democrats overwhelmingly very positive. Republicans are a little bit more mixed, but still 3.8. More of them support it than don't. Across the political spectrum, you'll find that when you talk about high-skill immigration policy, to politicians of any party, they're generally going to agree that international students who earn degrees in the US and want to stay and work here should have that opportunity. That is not a controversial opinion. It's the rest of immigration policy that's hyper-polarized and that makes it really hard to pass this legislation. But let's talk about the executive branch now with an example of advocacy there. So J1 OPT, in 2020, the Trump administration was considering putting some restrictions on J1 visas and OPT optional practical. We were alerted to this by some contacts within the executive branch. And then we were told by contacts within the State Department that stories about how these visas and programs help US science would help them make the case to preserve them. So we decided to send out a call to action to our members, asking folks to write in with stories about how they might have personally benefited from one of these programs, how their lab might have, how their graduate students might have, and we got over 100 responses. So this is an advocacy technique known as story banking. So you collect and record personal stories to then strategically deploy in future advocacy. And we definitely did deploy these. First, we shared the responses with the State Department, but then we also turned them into a report. You can see the cover on the screen. So this report was shared with the executive branch. It was shared with members of Congress, with Hill staff. And the report covered the trends that we were seeing and the stories that people told, as well as highlighting a few of the most impactful personal stories we received. In the end, the Trump administration did put restrictions on J1 visas, but STEM was excluded from those restrictions. Optional practical training guidance for STEM students was unchanged. This was a relief for our community and realistically a win within that political climate. Yeah, go ahead.
Prior to like get ultimately not necessarily that we had a very bad question.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Yeah, what does it look like to like get this like reading material into people's way? That's awesome.
So I think you said, what does it look like to get this sort of reading material to people who don't agree with the policy?
Right.
That's a great question. So within the government affairs team of APS, we have 4 registered lobbyists, including me, but I am the only one who works on the grassroots grass tops angle. So the rest of them are generally spending more of their time meeting with members of Congress and especially professional Hill staff. So all of the committees in Congress have professional staffers. They are partisan, but generally these are folks who are subject matter experts and are a little bit less affected by the hyperpolarized climate and the swings of the political cycle. So first things first, we reach out to folks like that and they can help get it in front of groups. Then our next step, we need to get it in front of a really difficult office, would be to find a constituent and ask them to bring it forward. An office can be ready to refuse a lobbyist. It's a lot harder for them to refuse a voter. So that's the technique that we use. That answer your question? Great question though, thank you. All right, so here's one of the stories that we excerpted in that report. So Michael Kosterlitz is a US Nobel Prize winner who first came to the US on a J1 visa. So pretty clear how this visa can benefit the US with a story like that. This was actually a new policy topic to APS. We had not previously lobbied or advocated on OPT or J1. We also hadn't focused on how US scholars benefit from immigration and international students before this. Normally we focused on how international students and scientists benefit from immigration. But this is an approach that we've maintained in subsequent surveys. Here is another story from that report. So this was from a domestic graduate student at Harvard, who talked about how she had benefited personally from the international postdocs in her lab. I'd imagine that probably a number of you could tell stories similar to this. Personal stories are a key tool in advocacy. I think that scientists often think the best way to convince someone is with a compelling statistic, and that using a personal story will seem anecdotal or biased. But if you can, I would really encourage you to let go of that thinking. I gave you a lot of numbers earlier in this talk about the economic, workforce, and research benefits of immigration. How many of those numbers do you really remember now? Okay, a couple. It was 28.4 billion, but pretty close. So for most of us, the policies that we're talking about here have very real impacts on our lives or on the lives of friends, family, people we love. I know that that's personally true for me. One of my dads actually first came to the US on a J-1 visa. He came as part of the Fulbright Foreign Student Program from Panama. He grew up in the Chiriquí province of Panama, which is more than 6 hours driving away from Panama City. So as you can imagine, this was a pretty limited, an area with pretty limited opportunities for a young queer science geek back in the 80s. So instead, he came to the US. He earned a PhD in organic chemistry, and he ended up becoming a US citizen. He worked 10 years in biopesticide research, and then another 10 years teaching in US community colleges. So here is a photo of him today enjoying his retirement. Especially for immigration policy, stories are crucial to contextualize big numbers with the impact on real people. Politicians need to be able to look at these programs and the number of people that benefit from them and think about individuals in their constituency who have contributed and who have benefited from these. So let's talk about how you can advocate for immigration policy. So one of the things I would encourage you to keep in mind is that laws take many years of advocacy to pay off. Even when it's not immigration policy, the typical time frame for advocating for a policy and getting it passed is in the years, not the months. For immigration policy, you might need to make that timeline even longer. Also bear in mind that you're going to have more of an impact if you have a coalition behind you, if you're not just speaking for yourself. So you might think about, if you have one, would your graduate student union endorse the policy you care about? Can you find allies in other departments at other career stages who would support you, maybe sign on to a letter endorsing the policy you want to advocate? You could also consider contacting your university government affairs office to see if they support the policy that you care about. It's a basic tenet of grassroots organizing that you are stronger with other people. We are all stronger together. And similarly, if you find that there's another organization that's already doing work on the policies you care about, you don't really need to duplicate that effort. Just join forces with them. Another key skill for grassroots organizing is learning how to ask for what you want for what you need. So that could be asking your friends, your colleagues to join your efforts. Try not to think of that as asking them for a really onerous favor. Instead, you're offering folks the opportunity to take action and make an impact on policies that matter to them and represent their values. When you're asking a policymaker for a change, you also want to think about what specifically you want them to do. If you go into an office and you ask them to support immigration, they're not going to do anything. It doesn't matter what party they're from. It's just too broad of an ask. They don't know what you want to see. So you want to come in and say, I want you to co-sponsor this legislation, or I want you to push for this number of visa seekers to be admitted, things like that. There's multiple paths for advocacy on this topic, but also on any topic. You could consider letter writing campaigns, op-eds, take meetings with your elected officials, get involved in allied organizations. could lobby your administration to adopt a stance on the issue. There's also direct action paths. You could start getting involved in protests or rallying to draw attention to the issue. If you're interested in something you can do right now, one option is to go to the American Physical Society's Action Center, where you can send a letter to Congress in support of the Keep STEM Talent Act in less than 5 minutes. We also have an option to write your own letter on any topic. Then if you want to undertake independent advocacy, there's a couple other resources I would highlight for you that are on APS's website. One is this effective messaging tips sheet, which gives you detailed tips and tricks on how you can make the biggest impact in a meeting with a policymaker. Then we have this advocacy worksheet, which can help you go from I care about this issue to having a detailed action plan, having identified allies, and having next steps for how you're going to actually impact that issue. But if you are curious about a career in the field, and I know a couple of you are, a few more tips that I would recommend. So careers in science policy and advocacy generally fall into these 3 brackets. So government jobs are like working for a legislator, working for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, working for a science agency like NSF, NIST, NASA, for the Astro folks in here. Lobbying jobs are like what I do. So the definition of lobbying is attempting to influence government through government action through written or oral communication. And lobbyists legally are people who spend more than 20% of their paid time on that. Then there are think tank jobs. So these are generally policy analysis jobs that don't involve significant advocacy. So you might be writing policy briefs or creating policy recommendations based on your research, but you're not going to spend significant time sharing that with government officials because that would push you over into lobbying territory. My path was a bit different than yours since I don't have a graduate degree, but I will briefly share it anyways with a couple of caveats. To be clear, APS is a nonpartisan organization and my work for APS is nonpartisan. It's pretty clear where my personal politics lie based on where I worked previously, but I just wanted to make that clear. So I'm actually the only one of my colleagues in APS's government affairs team who doesn't have a PhD in a STEM field. So all of you who are pursuing PhDs, you are the one who is best situated for these sorts of jobs and you're in high demand. I got my bachelor's at Emory in physics and political science. And then my first job was fall 2016, door knocking for a Georgia State House campaign. Then in the summer of 2018, I interned with the Georgia House Democratic Caucus. There I was doing opposition research, which is basically digging up dirt on competitive candidates on the other side, as well as writing policy briefs to make sure that new candidates understood what the party's platform was. Then 2018 to 2019, I volunteered with Democrats Abroad to do voter registration abroad, which was honestly awesome because I am a night owl and I could volunteer at any time of night calling like people in Asia at like 3 a.m. Then summer 2019, I interned with Flip the West Political Action Committee, so a PAC. They're today known as Activate America. Again, there I was doing a fair amount of opposition research, but also doing grassroots organizing, creating volunteer materials so that folks could go out on their own and make an impact. Then briefly, winter 2020, I was a fundraiser for the Democratic Party of Georgia. But then the pandemic hit, I had to move out of Georgia. So June 2020, I joined APS as the organizer for the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. So here I was working just on nuclear policy and helping physicists talk to Congress about that sort of policy. That group is now no longer affiliated with the American Physical Society. Now they are partnered with the Arms Control Association. And then I also did some work on physics in the meantime, but I didn't really cover that. Go ahead.
I guess more question about the physics coalition for the reduction, like
Yeah.
what exactly did that work entail?
Yeah, so I was not a lobbyist then, so I was spending less than 20% of my time on advocacy, and we had to kind of ride that line carefully. So part of that was organizing talks, honestly like this. So scheduling talks at physics departments around the country related to nuclear weapons policy. It was also training volunteers to take meetings with Congress and creating like letter writing campaigns on nuclear policy topics.
How much do you think your political science? Degree also if this back, do you think you would have taken the same road or just a physics major?
I mean, I was a physics major before I was a political science major. I like came into college very much intending to get a PhD in physics, but I came in 2016 and then Trump was elected. And I was like, maybe actually they do need more people working in this than I thought. So that was when I had it on political science as a sophomore.
I think that was simple. And do you think physics majors without a political science background be able to do the same things that you did?
I think that honestly, the major is not, I barely use what I learned there in my day to day. It's really the like volunteer and internship experience that had the bigger impact and that I think helped me get the job I currently have. So I don't think that you need to have a political science major, minor, certificate, anything to go into these jobs. And my colleagues, none of them have political science backgrounds. Yeah.
So you like talk about registered or like.
Yeah.
Let's say, is it a legal status?
Yes. So it's a legal status. It sounds kind of scary, but it's not. Basically, it just means that I have to report to the government every like 6 months, let them know what money or significant in-kind contributions I made to political action committees. I don't donate significant amounts of money to political action committees, so I just kind of like check in and let them know that I didn't donate. Yeah.
As a lobbyist, does that, like, as a registered lobbyist, does that affect your ability to like, say you want to like volunteer on a campaign, or say you want to like go knocking door to door, can you do that now as a registered lobbyist, or like, how does that work?
That-
Can you repeat it again, sorry.
Yeah, so the question was kind of shortening it. Let me know if I'm not capturing the key thing, which is how does being a registered lobbyist limit what sorts of volunteer political advocacy you can do? Is that what you're asking? So being a registered lobbyist doesn't limit what sort of volunteering you can do. The main limitations that it has is it's not a legal limitation, but some politicians will not hire lobbyists within a number of years, like since they've been a lobbyist, or sometimes they'll only hire with a waiver. Normally that's Democratic politicians that want to make clear that they're not beholden to like special interests. But also normally the types of lobbyists they care about are corporate lobbyists. Like they don't want to hire a big oil lobbyist right after they like left the job, because it might seem like they are actually beholden to big oil corporations. Generally not association, nonprofit lobbyists. Normally those folks can get waivers if they want to do those jobs. Then the other impact is that some mostly Democratic politicians, but some Republicans will not take any donations from lobbyists. I know Pete Buttigieg didn't take any donations from lobbyists. All right. So some entry points that you could consider if you want to go into science policy. One of the most common routes for folks in your shoes to get into this field is through a fellowship like the AAA fellowship, where you're going to be placed in a government office. Generally, these are legislative offices, but sometimes agency offices. And you will be there mostly to provide technical expertise, but you'll get experience with a wide range of policy work. These fellowships are postdoctoral fellowships, so the right time to be applying is in your final year, but it's never too early to start thinking about them. AAS, for the Astor folks in here, also has the John Bachal Public Policy Fellowship, which gives you lobbying advocacy experience. So you're placed within their government affairs office, doing advocacy on behalf of AAS. And actually one of my colleagues at APS came to us straight from this fellowship. There's also policy research fellowships. So these are generally going to be with think tanks, NGOs, nonprofits, and you'll generally be doing science policy research and creating reports and briefs. Can also go straight for an entry-level job in this field if you have significant advocacy experience already, like volunteer advocacy experience. You don't have to do one of these fellowships for. So some of the key skills to think about in terms of what do you need to make sure that you can adequately prove on your resume if you want to get a job in this field. So I bet that most of you already have these from what you're doing right now. Communication skills, so both written and oral, fairly important, but there's a lot of ways that you can develop those. Research and analysis, I think you've all got that covered, but you will need that and be able to apply it to more social sciencey data. Persuasive skills, so that's both for persuading policymakers to agree with you, but also persuading advocates and the public to agree with you, sharing data in a compelling way. Also, something that's really important is to demonstrate an interest in the field. So if you just apply for one of those fellowships and say that you care a lot about the issues, but you haven't done any volunteer experience, you have no previous advocacy experience, you're probably not going to be taken that seriously. Recruiters for both fellowships and jobs in this field are looking for more than just passion. They're looking for commitment. These are selective fellowships, so they want to make sure that they're giving it to someone who's really going to take that opportunity and run with it, who's seriously considering a career in the field and isn't just looking for like a brief intermission before going back to like faculty. All right, and with that, that wraps up my presentation. So if there's any other questions that folks have, I'll also go ahead and pass around these buttons if anyone would like one.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. The first one is about the issue just said about like showing the interest. Could you guys kind of a little bit more about what sorts of opportunities that like that we might be looking at for like say level while doing your PhD to kind of go for that? Like I'm thinking, does that mean like launching your campaigns or something like that, launching reports, like if you could expand a little bit on. And then just to put it out there, you had one slide talking about 8 kinds of jobs. And I was wondering if you could speak a little about what kind of aptitudes are different between each of the jobs, like as part of like what kind of work we'd be doing and what skills that would suit each one.
Absolutely. So to repeat those questions, the first one was, oh, now I'm forgetting the first one.
The first one was just about
It was about what type of volunteer experience you could do to demonstrate commitment to the field to be well positioned to apply for these fellowships. And then the second one was about the 3 baskets of types of policy jobs that I highlighted and what sorts of aptitudes or skill sets would position you well for each, right? Okay, so for your first question, basically any of the types of volunteer experience that you listed, so working on campaigns, working with organizations doing advocacy, working like within your department, organizing things like this sign call for Paul speaker panel, any of those could work to demonstrate that sort of commitment. It's just that overwhelmingly we see in the folks who successfully apply for the AAAS fellowship, they had some significant volunteer experience, or sometimes did a fellowship, like a summer fellowship or a part-time fellowship that was focused on policy or advocacy. So I know that the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction has a fellowship, which is part-time, meant to slot in among the like full-time commitments that grad students have, where you could get some experience in the nuclear policy field. So there's opportunities like that. Then your second question, I'm going to click back to that slide. So for these three types of careers, what sorts of aptitudes each might appeal to. If you aren't a super extrovert, and the idea of having a significant part of your job be meeting with strangers and talking to them and building relationships, then probably a think tank job is your best bet. So that's going to be the closest to academia, where the bulk of your time is spent on research, and where your main communication style will either be writing reports, or presenting those reports in fairly structured academic style presentations. Lobbying and government jobs, both are going to be slightly better suited to folks who are comfortable spending a lot of their time talking to other people, extroverts. But you don't have to be an extrovert. I don't actually consider myself an extrovert. You just need to be comfortable talking to strangers. I would say that one major difference between government jobs and lobbying jobs is the pace of the work and the range of topics you might be working on, especially for Hill jobs. Those are notoriously fast-paced, grueling. A very common path is that folks start in a Hill job when they're young and don't mind like crazy hours, and then they go into a lobbying job once they actually want like 9 to 5 and a decent salary. However, that's for Hill type jobs. NSF, NIST agency jobs, they're going to be more 9 to 5, calmer, easier to do for an entire career. Lobbying jobs are good if you just want to work on one policy issue, because you could work for a group that like just does immigration policy or just advocates on like your area of research. But government jobs, you'll typically need to have broader science policy expertise. So on the other hand, if you want to work on a variety of science policy topics and not just be concentrated on one for your career, a government job would probably be better suited, unless you go for a lobbying job for an organization like APS that has maybe 8 different issues they advocate on, if those 8 happen to be the ones that you wanted to work on. Does that answer your question, Blaine?
Yes, very good.
Any other questions?
I know you said that like APS doesn't advocate for H-1B issues because there's no consensus in the community. Can you talk at all about like what the different, I guess opinions are in the community? Like what's the divisive issue there?
To be honest, I am not super informed on it. They made the decision way before I joined APS. Any other questions?
I just available in the afternoon, so please feel free to sign up. You want to Charlotte?
All right, thank you.
Again.